Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 5th session in American English Live Teacher Development Series 6. My name is Lauren, and I'll be with you today along with my colleague behind the scenes, Heather, who will be serving as moderator to help answer your questions and respond to your comments during the session. Today, our host, Kate, will be talking with our presenter, Tabitha Kidwell, about formative assessment and strategies teachers can use to check for understanding, track student progress, and increase student learning. So let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. As Lauren said, my name is Kate, and I'm very happy, as always, to be here with you today. We'd like to extend a warm welcome to any of our first-time viewers, as usual, and of course, we're really happy to see those of you who have joined us many times before. Let's begin today with these great photos submitted by Yolanda Reyes, featuring future teachers from Bataan Peninsula State University in the Philippines, while they were participating in an American English Live session earlier this series. We love to see teachers learning together, so please share your photos of your viewing groups by emailing them to americanenglishwebinars@fhi360.org or by sharing them on social media. If you share on social media, please make sure to tag us at American English for Educators, and we will hope to feature one of your photos in the next session. Today is our 5th session in Series 6. Our remaining webinars are related to Foundations of TESOL Methodology. Which sessions have you enjoyed so far, and which ones are you looking forward to? Share your responses in the chat. And of course, we hope that you can use the great ideas we share with you throughout the series in your classroom. A very important announcement. We are going to have a time change in the United States on November 3rd. So daylight savings time ends in the United States on November 3rd. On that day, we switch to standard time, which means that we set our clocks back 1 hour. So our 6th session, American English Live 6.6, will still take place at 8 a.m. and 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in Washington, D.C., but you may find that the webinar is broadcast 1 hour earlier in your local time zone. So please use the time conversion link provided here to confirm your local webinar start time, and be sure to enter the session date when you do so, November 13th. That way you will not miss any of the great webinar that we have ready for you for November 13th. All right, so as a reminder, here's what to expect today. Each session is about 60 minutes long and is often related to an American English e-teacher massive open online course or to a Teacher's Corner theme on the American English website. The presenter will present the material, and I, as your host, will ask questions and make comments too. But we really hope to hear from you, our audience, so that we can address your questions, concerns, comments, ideas, experiences, and contexts. So please share your thoughts in the comments or the chat box. When our session comes to a close in about an hour, you'll have an opportunity to receive a digital badge for your participation. At the end of the session, we're going to share a link in the comments and at the top of this post. Click on that link and complete a short quiz about today's session. You must answer 2 out of 3 multiple choice questions correctly in order to pass. And once you have successfully passed the quiz, you can expect to receive your badge via email within about a week. We're excited to announce the relaunch of one of our most popular free massive open online courses, English for Media Literacy. In this MOOC, participants will examine how diversity representation in media influences individual identity and society. They will also develop an understanding of the role media plays in everyone's life while building vocabulary and language skills needed to analyze what we read and watch. The course opened on October 21st, and it will remain open until January 13th, 2020. Learn more and register at the link shown here and that we're sharing in the comments. And now for today's session, formative assessment strategies for the student-centered classroom. Formative assessment is an essential element of student-centered classrooms. Teachers who use formative assessment techniques can identify students' current levels, differentiate their instruction, and help all students achieve standards-based learning outcomes. This webinar discusses the concept of formative assessment and shares strategies teachers can use to check for understanding, track student progress, and increase student learning. The strategies shared here can be used with students of all levels and ages, and today you will reflect on your own teaching practice and gain ideas you can implement immediately in your classroom. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Tabitha Kidwell. Tabitha Kidwell has taught languages and trained teachers on 5 continents. She was an English language fellow in Indonesia from 2011 to 2013 and has completed English language specialist positions in Indonesia, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. She's interested in language teacher education, innovative TESOL methods, and the role of culture in language learning. She holds a PhD in applied linguistics and language education from the University of Maryland and currently teaches academic writing at American University here in Washington, D.C. So welcome, Tabitha. We're very happy to have you here with us today.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for the introduction. And thanks everybody for being here with us today. Welcome to American English Live 6.5. I am very excited to speak with you all today, and I'm excited to share some ideas about an approach to teaching that uses assessment to inform instruction and improve student achievement. So this presentation is definitely going to share some easy to implement sort of teaching tips, but it will also discuss ways that you can transform your teaching and transform the way that you look at teaching, learning, and assessment. So in this approach, assessment is an important building block for student learning. Teaching in this way has helped me to be more successful as a teacher, and I hope that you'll find these ideas as powerful as I have. So in today's session, we're going to build a shared understanding of assessment-related terms, talk about some key terms. We will examine the formative assessment cycle and learn what that means. And then we'll discuss 4 principles of formative assessment and how they can be applied in the classroom. Those 4 principles are clear learning targets, frequent checks for understanding, tracking individual student progress, and differentiating instruction. So let's get started. The central concept of this presentation is assessment. So I'd like to start by getting all kind of on the same page. What do you guys think about when you hear the word assessment?
All right, everyone, we'd love to hear from you. Please let us know what are some ways that you think about this term assessment. What do you think of? Maybe what do you think of? How would you define it? We'd love to hear from you. All right, let's see. I see a couple people saying test. What else? What do you think of when you think of the term assessment? Let's see. We are waiting for the millions of responses coming through. One moment. Let's see. Evaluating a student from Alejandra. Output from Rizwan. Let's see. Quizzes, a test from Shazia. Checking students' performance from Nasera. Gauging students' ability from Jenny. Evaluation from Rizwan. Actually, we do have a lot of responses coming in. Let's see, giving feedback from Marco. Assessing students' performance. And checking understanding from Hamid. Very nice, great answers, everybody.
Yeah, it sounds like everybody has some familiarity with this concept, and it sounds like you guys have already kind of a broad familiarity, not only thinking of assessments as tests. So that's great to hear. So let me just share my definition of assessment. I consider assessment to be all of the methods and tools that educators use to measure students' educational needs and learning progress. So that's intentionally a very broad definition, and that's because assessment takes many forms. For a lot of people, when they hear assessment, they think test. But assessment, as you guys just shared, is about a whole lot more than just traditional tests. It's everything that teachers use to get information about students' needs and student learning. The two major types of assessment that teachers conduct in their own classrooms are formative and summative assessment. Those are two important but kind of complex terms. So let's look at those two ideas in more detail. So we're going to learn a lot about formative assessment during this webinar, but here's an overview for everybody. Formative assessment is a process that takes place during learning. That way, students and teachers can use the results of the assessment to help them continue to improve. The primary purpose of formative assessment is to identify students' current levels so that they and their teachers know the next steps that they should take. Formative assessment can be used to give grades, but it can also be used in association with practice activities that aren't used for grades. Some people call formative assessment assessment for learning, and that's because it's a process that helps students learn more effectively. And really, almost anything that teachers do during lessons can be used as a form of formative assessment. Summative assessment is a little bit different. Summative assessment takes place after the learning is over. So its primary purpose is to determine what students have learned. It's often used for grading or evaluation purposes. And some people call it assessment of learning because it's a measure of how much students have learned at the end of the process. Often it's a more traditional measure like an exam, a final exam, a national exam, a standardized test. But teachers can also use less traditional measures like papers, presentations, portfolios, projects. Those can also all be summative assessments. So summative assessment definitely plays an important role in the education process, but teachers are missing a big opportunity if they only use assessments for summative purposes and not for formative purposes as well. So before we dig into how to use formative assessment techniques in your classroom, I want to define formative assessment clearly for everybody. Basically, formative assessment is all of the methods and tools that educators use to get information about student progress and help them learn. So formative assessment is anything that gives you information about students' progress. That means that almost every class activity can be used for formative assessment as long as there's still an opportunity to continue learning. So here are some examples of classroom activities that can be considered formative assessment if teachers use them to learn about students' current levels and help them continue to improve. So asking comprehension questions can help teachers see students' current understandings. Grammar and vocabulary exercises can show what aspects of language students have mastered and what they still need to work on. Pair and group work can let teachers measure students' interpersonal speaking skills as they work together. Student presentations provide evidence of students' ability to use presentational speaking skills. And drafts of writing show students' current writing abilities. So you guys probably use many of these activities as learning activities in your classrooms, but they can also function as formative assessment activities at the same time if you use these activities to get information about student progress and use it to help them learn. So I want to ask you guys, what are some examples of assessment activities that you use to get information about student progress during the learning process?
Great. What do you think, everybody? What activities do you use to get information about student progress during the learning process? And feel free to share maybe some of the ideas that Tabitha shared or things that you're doing. You can share those, or you can share other examples too. So she was sharing about asking comprehension questions, grammar or vocabulary exercises, student presentations, group and pair work, things like that. So what activities do you use to get information about student progress during the learning process? Let's see. Sadaf says presentations, quizzes, projects. Kenya says homework. Famida says through quizzes. Let's see. Role play, presentations from Sidra. Let's see, textbook activities, posting on Facebook class group. That sounds kind of fun, Josue. Let's see, group work, competition, open-ended questions from Nels, matching vocabulary games from Roger, asking meaningful questions from W. Eduardo. Great, lots of really wonderful ideas, everybody. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, great. So the truth is just about everything that you guys mentioned can be considered formative assessment. Really, any activity is formative assessment if teachers use it to get information about student progress. In more traditional approaches to assessment, teachers really emphasized only summative assessment. They saw assessment as something that happens after learning, not during learning. But trends in education over the last few years have raised an increased need for formative assessment. And many of you are probably already familiar with these trends. The first is the idea that education should be student-centered. So in the more traditional teacher-centered classroom, usually the teacher lectures and the students take notes. It's very much the teacher has all the knowledge and is giving it to her students. And research and probably all of your guys' practice has shown that this is just not as effective as a student-centered classroom. In a student-centered classroom, students are actively involved in their own learning, and instruction is oriented around the active participation of the students. So in a student-centered classroom, teachers really need to know their students' current levels so that they can plan activities to take their students to the next step. So the second trend in education is the idea that education needs to be based on standards. So in your teaching context, you probably have some kind of standards or curriculum that you're expected to follow. So let me ask everybody out there, how do you decide what to teach? Do you have national standards? Do you have a curriculum at the school level? What guides your selection of content?
Great question. So it can be really difficult sort of to make decisions on what to teach based on all of the things that, all of the demands that are placed on teachers. But teachers, how do you decide what to teach? Maybe you have a curriculum, maybe a textbook. What are some of the things that you consider when you decide what to teach? Tayyib says that they use the curriculum. Let's see, Tausif says curriculum that's based on the school level. National standards from Zafar. Also from Sadaf, who also says national standards. Let's see. A lot of people who are saying national curriculum. Isaac, Jessica says following the syllabus of our program, which I think probably sounds like a school level curriculum. Rose Trapp says curriculum, syllabus, textbooks, and extra material to support from Karen Chura. And Kenye says they have a syllabus based on a course book. So lots of different responses, but a lot of similar ones as well. So thanks for sharing, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. So basically, it sounds like many of you can't just teach students whatever you enjoy teaching or whatever happens to come next in the textbook. It sounds like you need to teach them the knowledge and skills that are necessary for them to meet the standards or the curriculum or whatever is guiding your teaching decisions. So in some settings, students' achievement of those standards is assessed through a national exam or a standardized test. So in that setting, it's really important that what you teach is really well aligned with the curriculum or standards so that you're preparing students for those big high stakes tests. So formative assessment is important in both student-centered and standards-based teaching because it helps bridge these two ideas. Formative assessment helps our instruction be more student-centered because it lets us find out what our students' current activity levels are, and it helps us build teaching and learning activities that will help them continue to learn and grow. Formative assessment also helps our instruction be more standards-based because it helps us identify our goals and it helps us see students' progress towards the expected learning outcomes. So in some respect, formative assessment is kind of like a map. If you've ever used a map to get from one destination to another, you know that the most important piece of information on the map is the "you are here" symbol. If you don't know where you are on the map, It could be the best designed map in the world, but it wouldn't help you figure out where you need to be. So formative assessment gives us that information. It tells us where students are now, their current ability level. The second most important piece of information on the map is the destination. If you don't know where the place you're going is on that map, you won't know how to get there. And formative assessment also tells us what the learning goal is, what the destination is. It tells us what the expected learning outcomes are. So once we know where students are now, their current ability levels, and where they're going, their expected learning outcomes, then we can draw on this information in our planning and our instruction. As we do that, we'll progress through what we call the formative assessment cycle. So as we gather information about students' progress through formative assessment, we can adjust our instruction. And this is a major change from a summative assessment approach, where teachers traditionally planned, instructed, and then assessed in a very linear manner, with assessment being the last step in the process. In a formative assessment approach, you progress more through a cycle. Your entry point into that cycle will be planning. Teachers plan from the very beginning. They even plan before they've even met their students or know anything about them at the beginning of the year. So planning will be the first step. The next step is following that plan to deliver instruction. And then during or shortly after instruction, teachers will do formative assessment activities. And then the most important part, they'll reflect on students' performance on those assessments, and they'll use that reflection to help them continue to plan. And they'll continue to progress through that cycle as they continue planning, instructing, assessing, and reflecting. So this cycle can occur at various levels. The most basic way to understand it would be planning, instructing, and assessing one lesson, then reflecting on the results of the formative assessment as you plan the next lesson. But it could also be smaller than that. It could be seeing that students are struggling on one activity and adjusting your plan as you go during a lesson. It can also be bigger. So it could be planning whole units or semester-long programs based on student progress during the previous unit or semester. But the really important piece here is reflection. And it's also the major difference from a more traditional summative assessment approach. That's a really important point about formative assessment. Using formative assessment is not just about using some clever formative assessment strategies. It really requires teachers to take a new perspective on assessment as part of the learning process from the very beginning. So now we've kind of gone through the theoretical backgrounds behind formative assessment. And we're going to move on to the more practical portion of the webinar.
Sounds good. I have a couple quick comments that we have from our participants that I just wanted to share. Let's see, Jojo Benny said, if we consider the classroom road to learning, the perfect teacher is the one who knows how to relate the tasks and content to the assessment tools. So I just thought that was a great comment. Sounds like he agrees with a lot of what you're saying, Tabitha.
Yeah, it sounds like we're all on the right road in that case.
Exactly. And just a quick one as well about sort of the standards-based piece. Jessica Paula said, we use a standardized curriculum, but it's necessary to do a lot of adaptations according to our students' levels and needs. So really nice comments, everybody. Keep them coming.
Great. Thanks for sharing. All right, so the lesson I'm going to share is a lesson that I observed in Indonesia a couple of years ago. It was a 10th grade English lesson. And the teacher did many things well, but we are going to critique the lesson a little bit. So I'm going to use the pseudonym Fitri to talk about this teacher. So that's a fake name. And also this picture isn't actually of Fitri, but Fitri does teach in an Indonesian high school that's similar to this one in the picture. So Fitri delivered a lesson on compliments. She started by asking her students in Bahasa Indonesia, in their first language, what's a compliment? Who has given a compliment? How do you use compliments? How do you feel when you get a compliment? And helping them tap into their background knowledge about what a compliment is and when you would give one. Then she asked students to brainstorm different items that they could give compliments about. So as they were volunteering ideas, she wrote them on the board. And she wrote cell phone, haircut, clothes, hat, writing. And this was in a rural area. So my favorite one was that she wrote chickens. We could compliment somebody's chickens if they have nice chickens. So then the next step in her lesson was to give a lot of examples. So she walked around the room and she complimented things that students had. Wow, what a great pen. I love your shoes. What a pretty haircut. So she gave them a lot of examples of ways they could use compliments. Next, she invited 2 volunteers to the front to act out a dialogue together. And in this dialogue, the students were giving each other compliments and responding to compliments. So then those students sat down and Fitri asked the class, do you understand? And everybody nodded. And then Fitri kind of got excited and got the class pumped up a little bit and said again, do you understand? And now all the students were kind of smiling and laughing. Clearly she'd gotten their attention. And they said, yes, teacher, we understand. But Fitri wanted to get more energy up, so she asked them again, do you understand? And all of the students said, yes, we understand. And every student was really actively involved. So then Fitri gave students a list of 5 different items: clothes, a baby, a motorbike, a food, and haircuts. And she asked them to individually write short dialogues of somebody complimenting someone else on that item. So there are definitely some good things about this lesson. Let's start with the positive, and let me ask you guys, what do you think are some strengths of this lesson? What are some good things?
Great, so what do you think, everybody? Tabitha explained the lesson. We can kind of see the outline here. What are some strengths? What are some things that Fitri did well as she was teaching this lesson? What do you think? I see a lot of people saying that it was great, nice. Let's see. What do you think about this lesson? What are some of the strengths? I see a couple of people already commenting on some weaknesses, and we are going to address those in just a moment. What are some things that you liked about this lesson? I liked that she had really nice energy and seemed like she was really engaging the students and helping them to get excited about being in her classroom. Laura said Fitri was really motivated, and Claudia says she gave step-by-step guidance. The examples were from real life from Anita. I think that's a great point. She was very interactive from Tausif. And let's see, she checked their understanding. So yeah, great ideas, everybody. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, so she definitely had a very strong delivery style, and she connected to students' prior knowledge and even kind of gave them in person, in the moment, prior knowledge by complimenting on things in the room. And also her lesson clearly focused on just one objective. She was looking at and helping students practice giving compliments. So that's definitely a good thing. But now the moment everyone's been waiting for, it's always fun to critique other people. What do you think are some weaknesses of the lesson?
Yes, what were some weaknesses? How could Fitri improve some of the aspects of her lesson? What do you think, everybody? Let's see. Ronnie says she could invite the students to add more to her given examples. That's a good idea. Nahir says, do you understand is not a very reliable way to assess comprehension. All right, and Karima agrees. She said, I never ask my learners, do you understand? Let's see. Crystal says maybe she could have given clearer steps, maybe provide more background knowledge. Very nice. What else do you think, everybody? What are some other ways that she could have improved? She could ask more questions, or maybe more specific questions from Jessica. Let's see. She could have checked, one weakness is that she checked the comprehension at the end of class. Maybe she could have checked it throughout the lesson. And maybe she could have used more pictures from Rizwan. So great ideas, everybody. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the major problems is that her question, do you understand, she didn't really know if students understood until the end when she had every student do a written exercise. So she didn't check for student understanding throughout, and that meant that she couldn't track student progress and she couldn't give them any form of personalized instruction. She also didn't explain her objective to students. So students might have figured out, okay, we must be practicing compliments, but she didn't make that clear to them. So for the rest of the webinar, I'll discuss 4 different principles of formative assessment that would have improved Featre's lesson. And let's start by discussing the first principle, which is clear learning targets. So the competency that's written on this scroll is from the 10th grade vocational school curriculum in Indonesia. And the competency is compose oral and written text expressing and responding to compliments, paying attention to social functions, text structure, correct linguistic elements, and context. Whew. So this is a very complex competency. It's very compact. There's a lot included in here. So that means this is not the learning outcome that you would discuss with students. This is too complicated even for like me as a teacher to really see what is involved in this competency. I have to really break it up and think about what are all of the smaller pieces in that competency. So before I tell you what competencies I see going on here, let me ask you guys, what do you see within this competency statement? What are some sub-competencies, some smaller pieces that you see in this statement?
Great. So as Tabitha mentioned, this is sort of a mouthful, and there are many different sub-goals or sub-competencies within this competency from the Indonesian curriculum. What can you tell us? What do you see that are some smaller goals or smaller sort of objectives that we could kind of focus on as we are preparing for our class and our lesson within this broader competency? What do you think? Let's see. Ronnie agrees with you. She says students might be confused if you give this to them. Let's see. What else do you think? What are some smaller goals? Grammar. Nahir says there's some grammar there. Maybe text structure, linguistic elements. What other sub-competencies or smaller goals can you see here? Expressing and responding to compliments from Valentine. There are different skills like oral and written skills. That is from Atta. And Adganzaya also says that you could divide speaking and writing here. And yeah, that sounds about right. I think those are the sub goals that I can see our participants have identified.
And it sounds like you guys are on the same track that I'm on, because I identified a lot of the same things. So let's see how we could break this up. I see a few different things in here. First, yeah, there's oral and written, spoken and writing included in here. In terms of written language, that also connects to the idea of text structure and the fact that different types of texts or different genres would have different formats. We also have the 2 pieces of complimenting, which are expressing a compliment and responding to a compliment if we've been given a compliment ourselves. So already that's a few different learning targets. And then we still have something here about social functions and context. So when is it appropriate to give a compliment? Who is it appropriate to give a compliment to? How should you respond to compliments from different kinds of people in different settings? That can be really complex. And then we also have linguistic elements, and that's about the grammar and the vocabulary and students' awareness of the language features that are involved in these compliment giving sentences. So there's a lot going on here. I count at least 6 different learning targets. And if you guys have standards or curriculum that are complex like this, as you guys are deciding what to teach, you might want to also do something like this and have different colored pens or different highlighters so that you can break up the different pieces of these complex competencies. So here are the learning targets that I would share with students. I would have them I would start with, I can give spoken compliments and I can respond orally to compliments. So working exclusively on giving and receiving compliments through speaking. And then I would do the same 2 sets of learning targets through writing. I can give compliments in writing and I can respond to compliments in writing. I would also teach a learning target about the social function of compliments and when it's appropriate to give compliments. And then I would also include a learning target about the linguistic elements so that students develop linguistic awareness of the language they're using when they're giving spoken and written compliments and responding to compliments. So you would not use all 6 of these learning targets in just one lesson. That original competency from the Indonesian curriculum is one of about 12 competencies that are for the full year. So if you estimate that most school years are about 35 or 40 weeks, that means we could take like 2 or 3 weeks on these 6 learning targets from that original competency. So that means we could probably introduce 1 new learning target each class session while we're continuing to practice the ones we've already introduced. And that's a much more manageable pace than trying to do all of this at once. So to discuss ways we can use clear learning targets, let's look again at Fitri's lesson as an example. Here are some ways that Fitri could have used clear learning targets in her lesson on compliments. She could have started by introducing one of those learning targets at the beginning. So she could have told students, your learning target today is, I can give spoken compliments. That lets students focus on what's really important about her lesson that day. Then she could also use her learning target to help her limit and focus her planned learning activities. So any activity that she plans should be directly practicing that one learning target. If she's planning a lesson on giving spoken compliments, she's not planning activities that require students to respond to compliments or to give compliments in writing. But she could include focus on spoken compliments during the teacher modeling, during the guided practice, during the independent practice, throughout the whole lesson. Then at the end, she could remind students again of the learning target and encourage them to think about whether they achieved it or not. So in her original lesson, when she asked, do you understand? Students might not have even known what they were supposed to be learning. But by mentioning clear learning targets in the lesson introduction and conclusion, she can focus students' attention and increase their awareness of their own progress. This way, students know what's important about the lesson. So I want to remind you guys that this compliments lesson we're using is just an example. This principle could be used with any teaching context or any set of learning targets. So if you are working on the future tense, you might have a learning target that is something like, I can explain future plans. And you can use that learning target in the same way to give structure to the lesson, to make the expected learning outcomes more clear, to focus your lesson, and to help students be more aware of their own progress. So let's move on to principle 2. That is frequent checks for understanding. So more frequent checks for understanding would have given Fitri an alternative to asking, do you understand? During her instruction, she could have used a couple of strategies. She could have used comprehension questions. So rather than asking, do you understand? She could have asked students that require students to show that they understand. So she could have asked them, how do you form a compliment? Who do you give compliments to? If you are giving directions, you can check for student understanding of the directions by asking them questions about your directions. So how many minutes for this activity? Who do you work with? Or if you've just given information about grammar, you might ask students comprehension questions about grammar. So if you've just taught a lesson on forming the regular past tense, you can ask students, okay, to create the regular past tense, what 2 letters do we add to this verb? And if students can say ed, we know that they understand what we've just talked about. Another strategy for checking for understanding during your instruction is to use hand signals. Now be sure to use culturally appropriate hand signals because that can differ from community to community. But this is a good way to have students show their comprehension non-verbally. So you can ask them yes or no questions like, do you like ice cream? And they can show their answer by saying thumbs up or thumbs down. I like ice cream, I don't like ice cream. You can also ask them to show you a number of fingers for questions about quantity. So if you're talking about family, you can ask students, how many brothers do you have? How many sisters do you have? And have them show on their fingers how many they have. Or you can use numbers of fingers to show degree. So if you're talking about distance, you can ask students, how far is your house from the school? And maybe they'll say, oh, it's not far at all. It's just across the street. Or, whoa, it's so far away, very far. Those hand signals can also be used for students to show their self-assessment of their achievement of learning targets. So if you could ask students, okay, did you achieve today's learning target? I can give spoken compliments. And then they can show you pretty discreetly, pretty anonymously, yeah, I think I got it, or no, I didn't. Or they can show the degree of their understanding, like, totally got it, teacher. Or like, I'm not so sure about this one. So it gives some feedback in that form too. Another set of strategies that are used, another set of strategies for checking for understanding are used to help the teacher hear oral responses from many different students, rather than just the one or two who often volunteer. So these strategies let you gather information about student progress that you might not see if you always call on those same students. So the first question is name cards. And this would be where you have a card with each student's name on it and you pull one at random. That means that every student needs to be prepared. And that means that you're hearing from students you might not hear from otherwise. Another option is rapid response. And this is where one by one, each student shares their response to a prompt or question. This can combat students' anxiety about getting singled out if they get picked, because every student is sharing. Every student has to be prepared. So you can ask students, what's your favorite food? My favorite food is ice cream. My favorite food is chocolate. My favorite food is rice. And go around the room very quickly. So the last two strategies I'll share ask students to show their understanding through low stakes writing. And by that, I mean writing that is not graded. So the first option is a warm-up or an exit ticket. It's warm-up if it's at the beginning of class, exit if it's at the end of class. So for this, you can give each student a small sheet of paper, or you can even give them a sticky note and ask them to respond to a prompt or a question. So if you're practicing the future tense, you can ask students, what are your plans for the weekend? And the student in the example here has written, this weekend, I will see a movie and visit my grandmother. So that tells you, okay, this student can talk about their plans for the weekend. Great. The last idea is to use whiteboards. For whiteboards, each student responds to a question on an individual whiteboard. For this, you have to be sure you have enough markers and enough tissues or whatever to act as an eraser. But you also have the option to make homemade whiteboards. So I've done this before where I've gotten just like a plain white sheet of paper, and then you can put it inside a paper protector or a page protector that you can buy at a lot of office supply store. Or in some countries I've been in around the world, it's even like magazines will come packaged in a plastic sheath that you can use to create your own whiteboard. So that could be an option for you guys that would make whiteboards a little bit more cost effective. You can have students write their answers either in individuals or groups. So you can show students a picture of vocabulary and then ask them to write their answer and show it to you. You can ask them a question and then they write their answer and show it to you. And you get a good snapshot of what's going on in the class and what students are thinking. So Kate, have you ever used any of these activities?
I have, yeah, I've used some warm-up Post-its or exit tickets. I've used hand gestures or asking students to stand up or sit down, things like that.
Great, sounds fun. So how about everybody else out there? What strategies do you use to check students' understanding? Do you use any of these strategies we talked about, or do you use other activities?
Yeah, we'd like to hear from you, everybody. What strategies do you use to check students' understanding? So let's see. Santi says, I love rapid response. So that's a good one. Let's see. Assad says, hand gestures work really well. And Karima says, We have to make sure we're careful with gestures too. Good one. Let's see. Jessica says she asks a volunteer to repeat what they have to do so that she can tell that a student understands the instructions. Ronnie says that they use anonymous Q&A from Google Slides for students who are afraid to speak about things that they do not clearly understand. I would love to know more about that. I haven't heard about anonymous Q&A before. That sounds really cool. And a lot of other people saying that they've tried exit tickets or students writing on the whiteboard. Len Penn says turn and talk is a good one. So great. Yeah, good ideas, everybody.
Yeah, really great ideas. So let's see how Fitri's lesson might have looked different if she had used some of these strategies. So Fitri had a few different opportunities when she could have used checks for understanding. She could have done checks for understanding during her teacher modeling. So she could have given students a lot of example sentences and asked them to show on their hands how strong of a compliment it was. So she could ask students, or she could say to students, "You're wearing blue shoes." And for that, they would show no fingers, because that's not actually a compliment. That's just an observation or a fact. Then she could say something like, "Nice shoes." And maybe students would show one finger. That's an okay compliment, a little bit weak. Then she could say, "Wow, I love your shoes." And students would show two fingers, just so that's a pretty strong compliment. So this way, students are hearing a lot of examples, but they're also actively involved. They have a chance to show their understanding of what a compliment is. They're thinking critically about what they hear. You can be sure they're paying really good attention. This also gives students a chance to show their understanding when they're at the pre-verbal stage. So if they maybe aren't yet quite comfortable sharing a compliment themselves, they're still showing that they understand the teacher's examples through a nonverbal way. And that can be really helpful at the beginning of a lesson or when you're introducing something new. So next, Fitri could have planned a guided practice activity where she showed students pictures of various objects and asked each student to prepare a compliment about that object. She could have them share them with one partner, or she could do the rapid response technique where she asked each student to share a compliment. And she could challenge them and encourage them to say a compliment that nobody has said yet. To help students, she might include sentence frames on the blackboard like you see on the slide there. That can give them a little bit more support if they need it as they're beginning to practice. But this activity would give the teacher information about student progress, common mistakes, and their current levels. And then lastly, during the independent portion of her lesson, she could have had students prepare to give 5 compliments to other students, and then have them move around the room freely to give compliments to different students of their choice. As they're doing that, the teacher should circulate and listen to students' compliments so that she can offer them feedback on common mistakes or strengths that she hears. So if you implement just these first two principles, you'll really improve your teaching. That'll be great. But formative assessment becomes really powerful when you begin to implement the last 2 principles. So the third principle is tracking individual student progress. This is exciting because it actually brings together those last 2 principles. If you have clear learning targets and you're doing frequent checks for understanding, the next step is checking student progress on those learning targets. So you can do that by analyzing student performance during checks for understanding. That can be during any individual student work, whether it's written or oral. But you should always plan checks for understanding to focus on just one learning target at a time. And then that lets you use the student responses to see if they have achieved that learning target. So in the example you'll see on the slide here, exercise A, the teacher has prepared an exercise for students to practice the learning target. I can respond to compliments in writing. And the directions say, write a different response for each of these statements. So the student has written, "Thank you, me too, thank you, thanks, thanks a lot, thank you very much." So this student is able to write responses to those statements, but they're actually just all variations on thank you. So maybe this student doesn't actually have very strong abilities to respond in different ways to different types of compliments. So if the student received compliment 2, your kitten is so cute, it would be very logical to say like, yes, I love her so much. Something like that would be a little bit more logical. Another possible step is to use checklists to track student progress. So I'm sure all of us track student grades, but the difference here is that checklists of student progress are directly linked to students' achievement of standards-based learning targets. And that makes this a really powerful tool to be sure that each and every student is moving towards achievement of standards. So in the example that you see here, we've got our 6 learning targets along the side, and we have student names along the top. And as the teacher is doing class activities to practice these learning targets, she's putting a plus if students show evidence that they did it well, and a minus if students made some mistakes. And this lets teachers see 2 things. If the whole class is getting the learning targets overall, she knows it's time to move on. And if individual students, if some are showing that they're struggling or some are doing better, that means that she can know where each student is. So I will acknowledge this is really difficult to do on the individual student level in a large class. But you can still use a checklist to kind of track class progress overall, but it's really hard to do it if you have 45 names or something that you need to try and track. And that's just one of the challenges of having a large class. Some of the individualization gets lost.
Yeah, and Jumani agrees and says, we always have to adapt a teaching approach to the local context. So even if there's a large classroom and it might be hard to do the checklist or something like that, you can adapt some of these great ideas for your context as well. So thanks for that comment.
Yeah, so in that case, you'll just be more aware of groups of students or the class as a whole. So let's see how Fitri could have used this principle in her lesson. 2 of the activities that we talked about for the checking for understanding section are activities that could be used to provide evidence of student progress. So the guided practice where students are giving compliments about different items and pictures, and the independent practice where students are giving 5 compliments to other students. Both of those give us evidence for I can give spoken compliments. So during both of those activities, the teacher can record who makes mistakes and who gives correct compliments. That way the teacher knows who's doing well and who's struggling with each of those learning targets. So once you have information about individual students' progress, then you're ready for the final principle of formative assessment, which is differentiation. So this is a complex topic. Have you guys heard of differentiation before? And if so, how would you define it?
All right, let's hear from you, everybody. What do you think? What is differentiation? Let us know how you would define this, if you've heard about it before. How would you describe this very important topic? What do you think? Let's see, I'm seeing a couple of people write diverse learners. So yep, that's part of it. Let's see. How else would you define differentiation, or what are some things that come to mind when you think of this term differentiation? Let's see, Isaac and Jurgen said that they have heard about this. Jurgen says that this is a way to help some students with more teacher support, so maybe lower level students. Let's see, adapting outcomes from Enoch. Hazrat says that this kind of refers to the fact that students are different. Isma says that you can use the rapid response technique that Tabitha shared for different levels of students. Catering to different learning needs from Rose Trapp. Freddie says different learning styles. Manu also says that this is about students' learning styles. And Moises says knowing learning styles and meeting students' needs according to those. So great ideas, everybody. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of you might be differentiation experts.
Mm-hmm.
So I define differentiation very much in the same way that you guys did. So I'd say differentiation is adjusting instruction for students at different levels. So for struggling students, we would give them extra support. That could be in class or outside of class. That could mean reteaching concepts. So if students seem to be struggling with giving compliments in writing, you could re-explain the format for doing that. You could also show students more examples. So you could have them read a letter that has a lot of examples of written compliments. You could give them simpler practice activities, like an activity where they just have to add 1 or 2 words to a compliment sentence. You can give them just more opportunities for practice, and you can give them a lot of feedback on that practice. For students that are struggling, it's especially important to be sure to give them positive feedback and let them know when they succeed and when they're doing well, because it can be frustrating for them if they feel like they're just not getting it. So it's really important to focus on the positive with them. Then for advanced students, differentiation can mean giving them extra challenge. If a student has shown that they've mastered a learning target, you really don't need to have them continue to practice those skills. That's when you can start to have behavior problems, possibly because those students are bored. So instead, you can give that kind of student an assignment that would require creativity or authentic language use or interpersonal skills. So for example, if students have already mastered compliments in writing, you could ask them to write notes complimenting and thanking a favorite teacher. Or you could ask them to write compliments on their friends' Facebook pages. So let's look at opportunities to differentiate instruction in Fitri's lesson. Let's say Fitri used her checklist during the last lesson and saw that most of the class had made mistakes when giving spoken compliments, but 5 students had consistently been able to give spoken compliments correctly. She can plan activities for most of the students where they continue to practice giving spoken compliments, where they have more examples, more practice, and where they continue to get feedback on their progress. But then the other 5 students could plan a community service project. They could be asked to write compliments on sticky notes and place them around the school. And we have an example of that on the next slide. So this way, students are continuing to practice, but in a more self-directed and creative way. If Fitri finds through her formative assessment that almost all the students did well on giving spoken compliments, that lets her know it's okay to move on to the next topic. So maybe it's time to move on to responding to compliments or giving compliments in writing. Either way, Fitri's making instructional decisions that are based on students' performance on formative assessments. She's giving them instruction at the right level for their needs, and she's also helping them achieve standards. So that wraps up our discussion about 4 important principles of formative assessment. So to refresh your memory, those 4 principles were clear learning targets, so targets that are based on standard but are simplified enough so that students can understand them and so that teachers can understand them. Because when teachers really understand their learning targets, then they can use them to plan their lessons and to focus their lessons. The second principle was frequent checks for understanding. So not just asking students, do you understand, but planning activities that let students show if they've understood or not. So examples were rapid response, hand signals, exit tickets, whiteboards. The third principle was tracking individual student progress. And that means analyzing student performance on the formative assessment and possibly using checklists to keep organized and see patterns in our instruction. And then lastly, differentiating instruction. So moving on if students are ready, continuing to practice if students still need it, and possibly planning activities for groups of students if they're at different levels. So how about you guys? What idea or ideas from this webinar are you guys going to try in your classroom?
Yeah, what do you think, everybody? What ideas are you going to try in your classroom as a result of being at this wonderful session today? We're seeing a lot of people saying, thank you very much for creating this informative session, like Hazrat, and a lot of other comments that are very similar. Very beneficial, thank you from Wafa. But what ideas or idea from this webinar will you try in your classroom this week or maybe later on this month? Let's see. Checklists from Az Adine. checklists from Eileen. Giovanni is going to do a lesson about compliments. Assad says all of the above, of course. And giving students extra support from Mogun. And Nasira says that she likes the idea of the tickets. Wonderful. Thanks everybody for sharing those ideas.
Yeah, sounds great. Overall, I hope that you guys will use those ideas, but not just as fun classroom activities. I hope you'll use them as formative assessment activities. So as a means of getting information about student progress and using that information to help students continue to grow. So if you'd like to still learn more about formative assessment, there are some resources that you can consult. These will be available on the Ning that you will see on the next slide. But I hope that you'll be able to start using some of these formative assessment strategies to get information about student progress and use it to improve student learning. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks so much, Tabitha, for your wonderful session, helping us to better understand formative assessment and for sharing these great principles with us. Thanks so much.
Thanks to you guys.
And of course, we'd like to thank you, our audience, for your lively engagement and participation today and all of your positive comments and your wonderful questions and ideas about your experiences. We hope you'll continue to share your ideas on Facebook and on the Ning and with your colleagues there in your local countries.